A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
So our first official update for the year with the Australian Christian Lobby. There's always a lot on the political agenda, but Ashlyn Weiss is Australian Christian Lobby State Director for South Australia. Ashlyn's joining us. Hey Ashlyn, welcome back to 2020.
Thank you very much.
Ashlyn, let's get right into the meaty stuff here, because we've been talking about this for years, and now one of the most significant issues on the agenda for the whole nation will be what happened in the state of Queensland just last week, where the Queensland government ordered an independent review into puberty blockers. Give us your impression.
That's exactly right. We were very excited to hear about the move on Tuesday last week from the Queensland Health Minister, Tim Nicholls, who announced that there will be a pause on the prescription of puberty blockers and hormone treatments for children in Queensland. Now, many of our listeners will know that the ACL has been lobbying for this for a long time in every single state in Australia. And this announcement, interestingly, came just one day after the Trump administration in America announced a nationwide ban on affirming care for children in the US. So there's been a lot of movement globally to implement bans or at least a pause on these treatments for children in light of evidence coming out that they are in fact quite harmful physically for children, and also we cannot in our good conscience prescribe them, knowing that there's really no good evidence for any benefit that they produce in these children who are seeking to change their gender. So this was a really fantastic announcement alongside an independent review, which is due to come back in mid-2026 for Queensland.
So, Ashlyn, interesting that you mention the Donald Trump initiative, and it seems to be that he's given a little bit of courage to common sense, and it seems to be that that's come in Queensland, but he hasn't really just made that some sort of a blanket announcement either, because there's been nations in Europe, France, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden. They've all tightened regulations around these hormone therapy for children and adolescents. So it's not really just a flash in the pan decision. This is the stuff that's the evidence is building so strongly, isn't it?
That's exactly right, and something we like to point out in our advocacy to the Australian government is that this is not a right-wing or a left-wing issue, because we see, as you mentioned, in various European, Scandinavian countries as well that are seen to be more ideologically progressive in other areas, that they are simply just paying attention to the medical evidence that has come to light that puberty blockers are harmful for children. They lead to a potentially irreversible lifelong issues that could lead to sterility in children, for example, and cross-sex hormones perhaps even more obviously lead to health issues for children. So it's certainly, Australia's been behind for quite a while now in insisting that we continue on this pathway of prescribing these medications to children. So we're hoping that Queensland will be the first among all other Australian states to implement similar bans.
I think we might be having three cheers for the Queensland government announcing this will happen. It's not the only thing, though. The Queensland government's already announced earlier in the year, the 4th of January, I think it was, that it doesn't support expansion of Queensland's children's gender service. So do you think these sorts of things go hand in hand?
Potentially, yeah. And I mean, look, the Health Minister, Tim Nicholls, hasn't given any promises that this ban will continue after the review. So we're really just hoping that and praying and trying to influence the true independence of this review. We know that there was a review in Queensland under the former Queensland administration, which came out and actually supported puberty blockers and said there was nothing to see here. We've spoken with many politicians about a lot of our concerns and the problems with that review. And really the issue was it didn't interrogate the actual standards of care being applied, but said well, look, we are following current Australian guidelines and therefore there's no reason to change what we're doing. But the issue is, Neil, that the Australian guidelines are the problem itself. The Australian guidelines are what allows the prescription of these medications unquestionably, and has not considered new and updated evidence that these medications are harmful. So hopefully, that's just to say, hopefully this new review will be different, and it does appear to be more independent, which is a good thing, and therefore opportunity to hopefully get this puberty blocker ban to be made permanent.
Well, that's interesting to talk about that word independent. And if there is a shadow over the former review that came out in favour of these puberty blockers, it's interesting that the Queensland Health Minister, Tim Nicholls, says that you've got to have a real independence because the confidence in public health services depends on it being truly independent. And this would be the same right around Australia, wouldn't it? Because unless there's some sort of truly independent review, people are not going to be able to trust our health services.
That's exactly right, Neil. And so we have had similar concerns. So something to raise is that a couple of days after this announcement in Queensland, there's also been an announcement for a federal review of our gender clinic guidelines, which is also a very big announcement to discuss. But we've had similar concerns with this federal review announced that the people appointed to this review may be compromised in terms of having bias and already being ideologically wed to the idea that children can change from male to female or vice versa, and that it is always a good thing to enable them to take that pathway if they wish to. So yes, on Friday, our Federal Health Minister, Mark Butler, issued a media statement saying that he'd asked the National Health and Medical Research Council to devise new treatment guidelines. Now, we're not saying from the outside that this is definitely going to be a biased review. I think there'll be opportunity to wait and see and give the benefit of the doubt. But like you said, Neil, we're just really pressing the message that it's really important that this is truly independent and that we are willing to take a look at what we're doing in our gender clinics and potentially admit that maybe we've made some mistakes, which is never an easy thing to do, but it is very necessary in this case.
There's a little bit of contrast that's going on that we might all like to understand a little deeper, and getting your thoughts here, because the Queensland review has put things to a stop until that review is complete, as I understand it. But the federal plan under our Labor government is to take nearly 2 years for a review of transgender medicine for children. Some are saying, well, they're just going to be just talking about what we already know. Is there some sort of contrast here, the actions that are going on in Queensland? Is there a problem with the delay that might be happening federally?
Yeah, so it was really interesting timing that, so on Tuesday we had the announcement for the Queensland ban and the review, and then on Friday we had the federal government, right before an election, mind you, coming out and saying that they will review the current gender clinic guidelines. So a couple of things with that. As you said, it's not going to be completed until mid-2026. And in the meantime, no federal ban has been announced on these treatments. So we're not pausing these treatments while we're reviewing them. We're allowing them to go ahead. Also, the Assistant Health Minister, Jed Kearney, did release a video on the same day trying to quell concerns of trans activists and the trans community by, I suppose, implying that this review is not going to question trans care and that it's just sort of like a regular review and a regular update of guidelines. So that is a little bit different to the messaging that the Health Minister, Mark Butler, put out. So there's still a little bit to, I guess we're waiting to see what this review is really going to be. But as I mentioned before, we are concerned of potential bias. Originally, there was some concern that this was being announced to try and halt the Queensland review and kind of overshadow what they're doing there. But thankfully, the Queensland government has assured the public that it is going ahead with its own review and continuing with its Queensland ban on these treatments.
Interesting here, as I understand it, the LGBT community is welcoming the review too, but for a different reason. They're welcoming it because they think there's been some sort of a slowdown in the issue of these treatments for those with gender dysphoria. They've got a different spin on it, haven't they?
They do, and the Assistant Minister, Jed Kearney, sort of suggested that the trans community had actually requested this review, which would, if that is true, which would give, I suppose, rise to concern for us as to who is influencing this review. There is a common kind of expectation and attitude now in transgender medicine that for any sort of evidence that comes out to be legitimate, it needs to be informed by the opinions and views of people with what we call lived experience, so people who are transgender, who consider themselves to be the opposite sex and have gone through these treatments. Unfortunately, the problem with that expectation is you do get a lot of bias, and if the true result of the evidence is that these are actually not safe treatments and it's not a good idea to be giving them to children, then that sort of finding might be blocked by the fact that it's people in the trans community leading this, and they, of course, have an interest in this continuing. So, it's interesting to see that, and of course in Queensland we've got the trans community protesting against the Queensland ban on puberty blockers, but there has been quite the opposite reaction from the trans community towards this federal review.
Let's just come back to Cairns for a few moments, because as I understand it, some of this came out of a whistleblower report and something of an alleged scandal in the Cairns Sexual Health Service, where people who had been making complaints, there's one suggestion those complaints were just thrown straight to the bin, but there's been all sorts of issues around an unprofessional work culture happening in that Cairns Sexual Health Service. Have you got any comment to make about that?
Yeah, look, there has been a few whistleblower complaints and reports, and unfortunately it seems to be the way with these issues that it does take a bit of a scandal for governments to pay attention. So some of the whistleblower reports indicated that there potentially been concerns with young children receiving puberty blockers and treatments without proper consultation or without proper parental consent. So there was, I think, reportedly 42 patients between the age of 12 and 18 who had received treatment that did not adhere to what they call best practice guidelines, which might mean that there wasn't parental consent or there wasn't proper consultation. Of course, there is a lot of long-term impacts of these treatments that we have believed for a long time as ACL patients are not being properly informed about, even under our best practice clinic guidelines. So to get a child to truly consent to treatments that might make them sterile for life, for example, is a pretty tricky situation. And we've received a lot of anecdotal reports of children not truly understanding what they're actually signing up for. So this is a case where even those guidelines were not followed. It gives a lot of, I guess, it's a cause for concern that was happening, but we're hopeful that it's going to be now turned into a good situation where these practices are properly stopped.
Ashlyn, there might be, as I said, perhaps a few people cheering a statewide review into the use of hormone therapies in the state of Queensland, something of a delayed, but there is a review federally. I'm wondering if there's any sort of initiative that the Australian Christian Lobby has active right now that listeners can participate in. Some might be thinking, there's a review now. Do we do nothing more? What are you hoping that listeners to our conversation today might do, taking some level of responsibility for how these things might work out in some level of integrity?
That's great. Yeah, well, I would ask our listeners to do a couple of things. The first one, and actually the most important one, is to pray, please, for our nation and for Queensland and the federal government. With all these announcements happening very quickly, I think I've raised a few concerns about whether these reviews are going to be truly independent, what outcome they may lead to in the long term. So pray for Queensland that they will be able to maintain their ban on puberty blockers, and that children who are distressed by that news would receive actually much better care and the care that they need to be comfortable in their own bodies. And of course, for our federal Parliament review, that it would be truly independent and informed by experts who will accept the evidence that these medications are harmful. The second thing is to go to our website at acl.org.au, and in our Take Action part of our webpage, we have a number of live campaigns on this issue to advocate for federal bans on puberty blockers off the back of this news. And also there's a tab in there for Queensland to contact your local MP if you are a resident in Queensland. All these things are very helpful. I think as this is hot on the press and MPs are thinking about it, maybe even being confronted with this topic really for the first time, even though it's been news for a while, they haven't maybe had to face up and answer their constituents about what their position is. So it's a fantastic opportunity to reach out to your local MP and to express your support for these bans to take place.
Fabulous. So for listeners today, acl.org.au, and check out those campaigns that we're hearing about from Ashlyn Weiss, empowering you to take some action. So it's not just a matter of being exposed to some detail, help you understand things that are going on, but also there's an opportunity there to be empowered to take action. acl.org.au. ACL is the website for the Australian Christian Lobby, acl.org.au. Ashlyn Weiss is the Australian Christian Lobby State Director for South Australia. Ashlyn, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.